The snowstorm howled through the empty forest, its icy claws tearing through the night, and there, tied to a post, barely visible beneath the thick layers of frost, was a pregnant golden retriever. She had been left there, abandoned, helpless and alone. Days had passed, and yet she refused to give up. But just when her strength began to fade, something moved in the darkness. A shadow, watching her. Was it a savior? Or was it another threat lurking in the storm? What happened next was beyond anything she could have imagined. The wind howled like a beast in pain, whipping through the skeletal trees, carrying shards of ice that stung like tiny knives against the skin. The snow had fallen relentlessly for days, blanketing the forest in a suffocating silence, broken only by the wailing storm. The world had turned white, cold, merciless, and indifferent. She did not know how long she had been there. The days had blurred into an endless torment, hunger gnawing at her insides, the icy wind tearing at what little strength she had left. Her once strong legs had buckled under her, leaving her belly pressed against the unforgiving snow. Her breath came in shallow puffs, each exhale crystallizing in the frigid air. She had howled for her owner at first, pleading, crying, but no one came. No footsteps remained in the snow, no lingering scent to follow. Whoever had left her here had ensured she would not return. She was alone, or so she thought. Through the swirling snow, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a pair of amber eyes gleamed in the darkness, unmoving, watching. A grey wolf stood at the tree line, its powerful body partially concealed by the storm, its fur blending seamlessly with the frozen world around it. It had been there for hours, perhaps longer, silent, patient. The dog had noticed it before, when the storm had momentarily lifted. At first, fear had gripped her, but as the hours stretched on, the wolf made no move to attack. It simply watched. She did not understand. Wolves were predators. They did not linger without reason. She had seen them before, from the safety of her old home, a place that no longer existed for her. Her owners had feared wolves, always warning of their danger, their hunger, but this one had not come for her throat, not yet. A violent shiver racked her body, forcing a pitiful whimper from her throat. The sound was weak, barely louder than the wind, but the wolf's ears flicked at the sound, its head tilting slightly. The dog closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion pulling at her like an anchor. Her belly tightened. A sharp pain shot through her. She gasped, forcing herself upright. The first signs of labor were creeping in, slow but undeniable. She could not give birth here, not like this, not while trapped. Instinct screamed at her to move, to dig, to find shelter, to protect the lives inside her. But the rope held fast, a cruel reminder that she had no choice. Another contraction, stronger this time. The wolf did not leave. It did not move closer, but neither did it turn away. Instead, it lowered itself onto its haunches, settling into the snow as though waiting for something. Why? Another cry of pain tore from the dog's throat. She knew the scent of blood would come soon, knew that the smell of birth would attract more than just silent wolves. The forest was not a kind place for the weak, and she was weak. A wave of hopelessness settled over her, heavier than the snow pressing against her sides. But then, a sound. To be continued. The storm had not relented. The wind still howled through the skeletal trees, the snow continuing its merciless assault. The pregnant golden retriever shivered, her body trembling with both cold and pain. Each breath came out as a soft cloud of mist, fading almost as quickly as it formed. Her swollen belly tightened again, sending another sharp pang rippling through her. She whimpered, shifting her weight as best as she could, but the rope around her neck held firm. She had already chewed at it until her gums bled, had pulled until her body ached, yet the fibers refused to give. Her time was running out. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew that if she could not free herself soon, neither she nor the puppies within her would survive the night. But how had it come to this? She had once belonged to a home. Not perfect, not always kind, but a home nonetheless. Her owner had been a man in his 40s, rough around the edges, with hands that smelled of gasoline and cigarettes. He had taken her in when she was just a pup, a wiggling bundle of golden fur who had craved affection. And in the beginning, he had given it. She had been allowed inside, curled up at his feet by the fireplace, his rough hands scratching behind her ears. But something had changed. As the years passed, the man became colder. The warmth of his hands was replaced by impatience, his voice losing the gentleness it once carried. She could not understand why. Then she met him, a young man, no older than 20, who had come to stay with her owner for a time. His presence had unsettled her from the start. His scent was sharp, his movements unpredictable. And when no one was looking, his kicks were swift, his punishments cruel. She had learned quickly to stay out of his way. But then, one night, everything had fallen apart. She had been curled up in the corner of the small garage where she now slept, her belly already beginning to swell with new life. The young man had returned home late, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol, his steps unsteady. She hadn't done anything. She had merely lifted her head, watching, wary, but that was enough. She had tried to run, but he was faster. A rope had been thrown around her neck, yanking her backward. She had fought, claws scraping against the concrete, but the more she resisted, the tighter the rope became. Then she was outside. The cold had hit her like a wall. She had barely registered the snow beneath her paws before she was forced forward, dragged into the forest. The last thing she had heard before the footsteps retreated was his voice, slurred, careless, final. "Let's see how long you last out here." Then silence, and now here she was, alone, forgotten, fighting for more than just her own life. The cry for help. Another contraction tore through her, pulling her back to the present. She whimpered, pressing her head against the wooden post, trying to control the panic clawing at her chest. She had to get out. Summoning the last of her strength, she tilted her head toward the sky and let out a long, desperate howl. The wind stole some of her voice, carrying it off into the darkness, but the sound still rang through the forest, raw and aching. Then silence. She panted, her body sagging with exhaustion. Maybe no one had heard. Maybe no one would ever hear. But then, a shift, a presence. From the darkness beyond the clearing, something moved, a familiar shadow watching, the wolf. It had been lingering at the edge of the storm since the night before, neither approaching nor retreating, but now it stepped forward, its amber eyes fixed on her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the wolf lowered its head and stepped closer. A deep, primal fear rippled through her muscles, but she was too weak to react, too drained to even bare her teeth. If it had come to kill her, so be it. But it didn't. Instead, the wolf lowered itself onto its front paws, its massive head tilting slightly as it sniffed the air. Snow clung to its thick fur, frost catching in the tufts along its ears. Then, to her shock, it began to dig. Slowly at first, then more urgently, its powerful paws sent chunks of frozen earth and snow flying. The dog's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to believe what she was seeing. It wasn't attacking her, it was trying to free her. A fragile alliance. The wolf dug feverishly, exposing the base of the post buried deep in the snow. Then, without hesitation, it lunged forward and clamped its powerful jaws around the rope binding her. She flinched at the sudden pressure against her neck, expecting pain, but instead she felt a tug, then another. The rope tightened briefly, then snapped. She collapsed forward, her body hitting the snow with a muffled thud. She was free, but she could not move. Every muscle ached, every nerve in her body screamed for rest. She gasped, her vision swimming, barely registering the fact that she was no longer shackled. The wolf stepped back, watching her with unreadable eyes. Then, as if it had made a decision, it turned and walked away. For a fleeting moment she thought it was leaving, that it had done what it came to do and would disappear back into the storm, but then it stopped. It glanced back at her, its head tilting slightly. Then, with a flick of its tail, it stepped forward again, slowly this time, as if waiting for her. A shiver passed through her, not from the cold, but from something deeper. A question. Why? Why had it helped her? She did not have the strength to answer, nor did she have the luxury of wondering. Another contraction gripped her, sharp and demanding. She needed shelter. The wolf turned once more and padded forward, its massive paws barely making a sound in the deep snow. Without thinking, without questioning, she forced herself up, legs trembling, breath ragged, and followed. She did not know where it was leading her, but for the first time since being abandoned, she was not alone. The cave was small, carved into the side of a jagged hill, barely offering protection from the howling wind. Snow had already begun creeping in through the narrow entrance, gathering in frozen drifts against the walls. But for now, it was the only refuge she had. And now, at last, the storm outside was no longer the only battle she fought. 6 small bodies squirmed against her belly, their fur still damp, their tiny cries piercing the icy air. She had done it. She had brought them into this world. A mother's first duty. Exhaustion clawed at her limbs, but she did not rest. Instinct overpowered fatigue, commanding her to move. One by one, she licked them clean, removing the last traces of their birth, stimulating their frail bodies. She nudged them closer, pressing them into the warmth of her belly, shielding them from the cold. They were so small, so helpless, each one barely the size of her paw, their fur still thin, their tiny noses wriggling as they sought warmth. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 little souls born in the heart of winter. Her heart ached with love for them, but fear gnawed at her all the same. They were hungry, and she had nothing to give them. Her body had been pushed beyond its limits. She had gone too long without food, her ribs pressing against her thin fur. Could she even produce enough milk? The wind howled, rattling through the cave like a ghostly warning. The blizzard had grown fiercer, its rage unrelenting. The snow was piling high outside, sealing them further into the cave, as though the storm itself meant to bury them alive. And she realized, with chilling certainty, that if she could not find food soon, her puppies would not survive. A bitter struggle. She tried to move, tried to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her, every muscle screaming in protest. She was still bleeding slightly, her body raw from labor, the pain deep and relentless. But she forced herself up, taking a staggering step toward the entrance of the cave. The cold hit her like a wall, a brutal slap that stole her breath. The storm was even worse now than when she had first arrived. White consumed everything. The trees beyond the cave were nothing more than dark smudges in the swirling chaos of ice. She could barely see a few feet ahead, but she had to try. She took another step, and her paws slipped on the ice beneath her. Her weakened body collapsed back onto the frozen ground, her vision blurring. She lay there for a moment, panting, trying to summon the strength to rise again. The puppies whimpered behind her. She closed her eyes, a whine escaping her throat. How could she fail them already? She had survived the rope, survived the storm, survived the pain of birth, only to lose them now. Her body shook, not just from the cold, but from despair. She had nothing left, and then a sound, a soft crunch in the snow, a presence. The wolf's return. She lifted her head weakly, her blurred vision sharpening just enough to see the shadows standing at the entrance of the cave. The wolf. Snow clung to its thick fur, its powerful body barely flinching as the wind whipped around it. But it was not alone. Something hung from its jaws, a rabbit. A fresh kill, its limp body swaying slightly as the wolf took another step forward. The golden retriever froze, her body tensing. She had feared this moment, the moment the wolf would finally reveal its true nature. She was weak. Her newborns were defenseless. She had no means to fight, no way to protect them if the wolf chose to finish what nature demanded. But the wolf did not lunge. Instead, it stepped closer and dropped the rabbit at her feet. She stared. Her breath caught in her throat, her body too stunned to react. The wolf had brought her food. Why? Why would a predator feed another predator's young? It made no sense, but there was no time for hesitation. The puppies whimpered again, their tiny bodies pressing closer to her, seeking warmth and comfort she could barely provide. She lowered her head, her nose brushing against the still warm fur of the rabbit. Her stomach twisted painfully at the scent of food, but she did not eat. Instead, she looked at the wolf. For the first time, she truly looked at it. It was not as large as she had first thought. Its fur was thick, but beneath it she could see the sharp angles of its ribs. It was hungry, too, and yet it had given the kill to her. A heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the storm raging outside. Then the wolf sat down, not moving closer, not threatening, just watching. And as the golden retriever tore into the rabbit, her body finally receiving the nourishment it had been starved of for days, she realized something. The wolf had not just saved her, it had saved her children. A strange pact. The golden retriever ate quickly, her strength slowly returning. The warmth of the fresh kill spread through her aching body, her limbs regaining some of the power they had lost. She could feel it already, the milk in her body beginning to flow. The puppies suckled eagerly now, their tiny cries of hunger fading as they latched onto her belly, taking in their first true nourishment. They would live. She turned her gaze back to the wolf. It was still watching her, and for the first time, she was not afraid. Something had shifted, something deep, something primal. She did not understand it, but she felt it. The wolf had chosen not to be her enemy. But was it her ally? Or was there something else at play? She did not know, but as the storm continued to rage outside, as the snow piled higher, sealing them all further inside the cave, she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever was happening between them was only just beginning. The storm had finally begun to ease. Days had passed since the pregnant golden retriever had been abandoned to die in the snow, and though she had fought her way to survival, she knew she was not yet safe. The cave had offered temporary shelter, but it was not enough. The cold still gnawed at their bones, and the snow piled higher with each passing hour. Her 6 newborns had grown stronger, their small cries no longer weak gasps, but firm demands. She had nourished them, kept them warm with what little strength she had left, but instinct screamed that they needed more. They needed a real home. And so, when the storm finally broke, she knew it was time to leave. The wolf had remained by her side, watching, waiting, protecting. She still did not understand it. This creature, her natural enemy, had not only spared her life, but had actively helped her and her puppies survive. And now, as she stepped out of the cave, for the first time since giving birth, the wolf fell into stride beside her. She did not question it anymore. She was too focused on finding safety. The descent. The snow crunched beneath her paws as she carefully made her way down the slope, her 6 puppies huddled close against her legs. The path was treacherous, the ice was unforgiving, the wind still biting. But she pressed forward, nudging her little ones along, urging them to move despite their tiny, clumsy limbs. The wolf was silent, padding beside her with practiced ease, its golden eyes scanning the wilderness with sharp precision. It was looking for danger. She had come to rely on that gaze, even if she did not fully trust it. They moved slowly but deliberately. The forest stretched before them like an endless sea of white, the trees skeletal and silent. The world had been buried beneath the storm, and the once familiar landscape had transformed into an alien frozen wasteland. Then a sound, a low hum in the distance, a vibration in the air, something unnatural, something human. The dog stopped abruptly, her ears pricking up. The wolf did the same, its body tensing, nostrils flaring. There was someone nearby, and then, from beyond the line of trees, a figure emerged. The man who lived alone. David Campbell had spent the last 5 years in solitude. The cabin he lived in stood alone in the valley below, a small structure of aged wood and stone, nearly swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness around it. Once he had built that home for his family. Now it was just a house, a place where he existed, where he went through the motions of life without truly living. David had once been a detective, a good one. His hands had pulled people from wreckage, chased criminals through darkened streets, brought justice where it was due. His instincts had been sharp, his purpose clear, but none of that had mattered when he had lost them. His wife, his daughter, gone in an instant. A car accident caused by a drunk driver who had walked away with barely a scratch. And David, he had been left with nothing. The city had suffocated him after that. The weight of grief had pressed into his chest like a vice, each familiar street filled with ghosts. So he had walked away from it all, disappearing into the only place that did not remind him of them. The wilderness, the snow-covered forest had become his refuge, his prison, his punishment. Every morning he woke before dawn and walked the same paths, checked the same trails. He hunted when he had to, but mostly he watched. Watched the seasons change, watched the world move on while he remained frozen in time. But today, for the first time in a long time, something made him stop, something impossible. There, in the clearing ahead, stood a dog, a golden retriever, and beside her, a wolf. David stared. His breath caught in his throat as his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The dog's fur was matted and thin, but she held herself with quiet strength. Her body was curled protectively around 6 tiny puppies, their golden fur barely visible against the snow. And yet, she was not alone. The wolf stood at her side, not attacking, not threatening, standing guard. David felt something stir in his chest, something old, something familiar. Recognition, not of the dog herself, but of what she represented. A mother, fighting to protect her children. The instinct to help surged through him before he could stop it. Then another thought hit him. What if the wolf wasn't protecting her? What if it was waiting for her to collapse, waiting for her to grow too weak to defend the tiny lives at her feet? His fingers instinctively tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder. The wolf's head turned slightly, its eyes locking onto him. It knew he was watching. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then the golden retriever stepped forward. Her body trembled, her exhaustion evident, but her head lifted with quiet determination. She did not bark, she did not snarl, she simply looked at him. And David, who had once spent his life reading people, deciphering motives, understood. She was asking for help, not with words, not with sound, but with her eyes. Eyes that were pleading, not for herself, but for the tiny lives she carried. David's throat tightened. He had spent 5 years turning away. 5 years convincing himself that the world had taken enough from him, that he had nothing left to give. And yet, in that moment, standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland, he found himself faced with a choice that felt far heavier than it should have. Help them, or walk away. His fingers hovered over the strap of his rifle. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then, before he even realized what he was doing, he took a step forward. And the wolf did not stop him. The sky had darkened by the time David made his decision. For minutes he had simply stood there in the snow, staring at the trembling golden retriever and the 6 fragile puppies nestled at her feet. The storm had passed, but the cold had not. They wouldn't last the night out here. So, without another word, he had crouched down and extended a gloved hand toward the mother dog. She flinched. He saw it in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear, the deep-rooted instinct to run, but she did not run. She stood her ground, her ears pinned back, her body tense with exhaustion. It was not trust that kept her still, it was desperation, and David understood that kind of desperation all too well. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down and scooped up the first puppy. The tiny creature was barely bigger than his hand, its golden fur damp, its little body trembling against the cold. No growl came from the mother, no warning. Instead, she watched him with unwavering intensity, measuring him, testing him. David didn't break eye contact as he carefully carried the first pup toward his truck, opened the door, and placed it inside. The warmth of the cabin heater immediately enveloped the tiny dog. One by one, he carried the rest of the litter into the truck, and when only the mother remained, standing in the snow, her gaze flickering between her pups and the dark wilderness behind her, David did not force her. He simply held the door open. She hesitated, Then, after what felt like an eternity, she jumped in. But the wolf did not move, watching. Its golden eyes burned with something David could not name. Then, slowly, the wolf turned and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. David exhaled, shaking his head as he climbed into the driver's seat. He wasn't sure if he had saved those dogs tonight, or if they had just changed his fate instead. A place of warmth and ghosts. The cabin smelled of pinewood and old memories. The fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, its glow casting warm light across the wooden walls. David worked quickly, wrapping each puppy in soft blankets before setting them near the fire. Their tiny whimpers slowly quieted as warmth returned to their small bodies. The mother watched every movement with quiet suspicion. She did not trust him. Even as he gently placed a bowl of warm broth in front of her, even as he filled another with fresh water, she remained cautious. But she was starving. Hunger won over fear, and she ate, fast, too fast, as if she believed this might be her last meal. David didn't move. He knew better than to try and touch her yet. Instead, he simply sat back in his old armchair, watching her from a distance. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled. And inside, a golden retriever who had fought death for days was finally safe. Or so she thought. Shadows of the past. The night stretched on, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space. David remained awake longer than he had intended, his eyes flicking between the sleeping puppies and the mother curled protectively around them. She never truly rested. Even in sleep, her ears twitched at every sound. A survivor, a fighter. David leaned back against the chair, his eyes drifting toward the far corner of the cabin. His stomach twisted. The corner had been untouched for years. A single dog collar lay forgotten in the dust, its worn leather cracked with time, and engraved into the old brass tag, Maggie. The name she had forgotten. It was deep into the night when the golden retriever stirred. Something was wrong. The warmth of the cabin felt suffocating now, the walls too close, the shadows too deep. She lifted her head, her heart pounding, an unease curling in her chest like a rising tide. Something was here. Slowly, cautiously she stood. The puppies were still asleep, their small bodies nestled into the blankets near the fire. She took a step forward, then another. Her paws barely made a sound against the wooden floor as she moved toward the darker part of the cabin. And then she saw it, a small, old object lying in the dust. She froze, her breath hitched, knew that shape, a collar. She stepped closer, her nose brushing against the worn leather. Then she saw the tag. The letters were faint, but the name was still there. Maggie. A name she had once known, a name she had once answered to. Her legs trembled. A flood of images slammed into her mind. A little girl's laughter, the scent of warm summer grass, a man's rough hands scratching behind her ears, and then pain. A boot striking her side, a rope tightening around her neck, the sound of her own desperate whimpers lost in the wind. She staggered back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. This was the house. This was the house where she had once lived, where she had once belonged, before she was thrown away, before she was left to die. A low, strangled whimper escaped her throat, her body shaking. She turned toward the sleeping man in the chair. The man who had saved her. The man whose scent she knew now, whose voice stirred something old and familiar in the back of her mind. David. Her body tensed, her mind spinning. Was he the one who had abandoned her? Was he the one who had let her go, or was there another truth buried in the past? Her breath came hard and fast, panic rising like a tidal wave. She took a shaky step backward, eyes darting toward the door. Her puppies whimpered, sensing her distress. David stirred in his sleep, unaware of the storm raging within her, and outside in the frozen darkness the wolf waited, watching. David sat in the dim glow of the fire, staring at the old collar in his hands. His fingers traced the worn leather, the faded brass tag reflecting flickers of amber light. Maggie. The name felt like a whisper from another life, a name he had not spoken in years, a name that had been buried along with the memories he had tried so hard to forget. His breath was slow and measured, but inside, his chest was tight, his pulse pounding. The golden retriever lay curled across the room, her body stiff, her eyes watching him with something between fear and recognition. She knew this place. She knew him. And now, David finally understood why. The life before the loss. Years ago, this cabin had been filled with laughter. His daughter Emily had begged for a dog for months, her blue eyes shining every time she saw one on television, in books, even in the street. "Please, Dad, I'll take care of her. I promise." David had relented eventually, bringing home a tiny ball of golden fur that immediately became Emily's shadow. Maggie. They had been inseparable, a girl and her dog, bound by the unshakable love of childhood. She had taught Maggie tricks, played endless games of fetch in the backyard. On snowy days, they had raced through the drifts, Maggie barking in delight as Emily tumbled into the soft powder. David remembered the sound of his daughter's laughter more than anything. It had been warm, full of light, filling every corner of the house. And then it was gone. A single moment, a single accident, one careless driver, one phone call that shattered everything. Emily was gone, and with her, his wife's ability to endure the pain. She had changed after the accident. The grief had twisted something inside her, turned the warmth in her eyes cold. Every inch of the house reminded her of their daughter, of the life they had lost. And Maggie? She had been the worst reminder of all. The act of betrayal. One day, without warning, his wife had taken Maggie from the house. David had not been there when it happened. He had come home to find Emily's beloved dog missing, her toys abandoned, her bed empty. "Where is she?" he had demanded. His wife had not answered, not at first. Then, through tear-stained eyes, she had whispered the truth. I couldn't look at her anymore, David. Every time I saw her, I saw Emily. I saw everything we lost. I had to let her go." David had felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "You abandoned her?" he had asked, his voice hollow. "She's just a dog, David. Just a dog." David had searched. He had driven miles in every direction, calling Maggie's name, hoping, praying that she would come running, tail wagging, tongue lolling in that goofy, happy way she always had. But she never did. Eventually he had given up. His wife left not long after that, and David had stayed here, alone, drowning in silence. A painful reunion. Now, years later, Maggie had returned, not as the playful, carefree dog he had once known, but as a survivor, a mother, hardened by the world. David lifted his gaze from the collar, looking at her now, curled protectively around her puppies. She was no longer the same dog, and he was no longer the same man. She flinched as he shifted, her body instinctively tensing. She remembered, not just this place, not just him, she remembered being left behind. David's throat tightened. Could she ever forgive him? Or worse, did he even deserve it? A silent question. David exhaled, slowly setting the collar down on the wooden floor. He did not move toward Maggie. He did not call her name. Instead, he simply sat back, his hands open, his posture relaxed, giving her a choice. She was not the only one who had been abandoned. David had abandoned himself the day Emily died, the day he stopped believing he had anything left to give the world. Now, for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been wrong. Maggie's ears twitched, her gaze flickering between him and the collar. Then, after what felt like forever, she lowered her head and let out a slow breath. She was tired, she was safe, and for the first time since returning to this place, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest. David watched as her breathing steadied, her body finally surrendering to sleep. Maybe trust could not be rebuilt overnight. Maybe forgiveness was not something that could be given so easily. But maybe, just maybe, this was a start. David had always been a patient man. Years of working as a detective had taught him that trust was something earned, not given. But with Maggie, patience alone was not enough. She was here in his home, yet she was not truly with him. Her body remained tense whenever he moved too quickly. Her eyes, golden and wary, followed him with quiet suspicion. She accepted his food, his warmth, but not his touch. And David understood. He understood because he had done the same thing to the world for years, kept it at a distance. But time had a way of forcing choices upon people, whether they were ready or not. And for Maggie, that moment came sooner than either of them expected. A fight for life. The first signs were subtle. A slight whimper from one of the puppies, a hesitation in its movements, the way it struggled to find its mother's warmth, while the others nursed with ease. At first, David thought he was imagining it, but as the hours passed, the tiny pup grew weaker. It no longer suckled. Its little breaths came slow and uneven. Maggie knew. She paced around the whelping box, nudging the pup, licking its small body, whimpering in distress. But it wasn't enough. David could see it in her eyes, the helplessness of a mother unable to save her child. And that was when David did something she did not expect. He reached in. Gently, firmly, he picked up the frail puppy, cradling it in his rough hands. Maggie froze. A deep growl rumbled in her throat, her ears flattened, her body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to take back her baby. David did not back away. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked towards the fireplace, settling onto the floor. Carefully, he wrapped the tiny puppy in a soft towel, holding it close to his chest. Maggie's growl wavered. She did not move toward him, but neither did she lunge. She just watched. And David? David did not sleep. He stayed awake through the night, listening to the labored breaths of the fragile life in his hands. He warmed the puppy with his own body heat, rubbing its tiny frame, urging it to fight. Every so often, he dipped his fingers into a small bottle of warmed milk, pressing a drop against the puppy's lips. It was a long night, a desperate night, and Maggie, she never took her eyes off him. The breaking of a barrier. When the first light of dawn touched the cabin, the puppy was still alive. Its breaths had steadied. Its body, once cold and limp, had grown warm against David's chest. A small sound, a tiny, fragile whimper. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And then something changed. Something small but powerful. Maggie moved. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. She sniffed at David's hands, at the tiny pup nestled against him. Her breath was warm against his skin, and then she licked his hand. Not a demand, not a threat, a silent acknowledgement, a mother's hesitant trust. David swallowed the lump in his throat. Carefully, he placed the puppy back in the whelping box, where the others lay curled in sleep. Maggie settled beside them, immediately licking the pup, nudging it toward her warmth. David sat back, watching. Something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. But for the first time in years, he felt as if he had done something right. And Maggie? Maggie, for the first time since returning to this house, no longer looked at him with fear. The vanishing shadow. David finally allowed himself to sleep, but when he woke, something felt different. The air was still, too still. He glanced toward the door, his gut twisting. The wolf. It was gone. For days it had lingered, watching, waiting. It had not left Maggie's side, had not strayed far from the cabin. But now there was nothing. David stepped outside, scanning the tree line. The snow stretched unbroken, the usual paw prints absent. A strange sense of unease settled in his chest. Why now? Why, after all this time, had the wolf disappeared? Was it truly gone, or had it sensed something he had not? David's fingers tightened into fists. The storm had passed, but a new one might be coming. And this time, he was not sure what he was up against. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the land. The thick layers of snow had thinned, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. The trees, once burdened with ice, stood bare against the grey sky, their skeletal branches stretching toward the first hints of warmth in the air. And inside the cabin, life had truly begun again. The 6 puppies, once fragile and weak, were now strong and full of energy. Their golden fur had thickened, their tiny legs had grown steadier. Each day, their world expanded, first from the warmth of the whelping box to the wooden floors of the cabin, then to the porch, where they tumbled over one another, yipping excitedly at the strange, wonderful things outside. Maggie, too, had changed. She no longer flinched when David moved, no longer hesitated before eating the food he gave her. She had allowed herself to belong here. David had never forced it. He had never pushed, never demanded, and perhaps that was why, one evening, as he sat on the porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon, Maggie finally came to him. She approached slowly, her golden fur glowing in the fading light. Then, without hesitation, she placed her head against his knee. David froze. For a long time, he simply stared down at her, feeling the warmth of her body, the quiet strength in her presence. Then, carefully, he lifted his hand and ran his fingers through her fur. She did not pull away, and just like that, the last barrier fell. A home at last. The days turned longer, the cold retreating into the past. David had once believed the cabin was a place of isolation, a shelter built to keep the world out. But now, as he watched Maggie's puppies race across the snow-speckled ground, as he listened to their playful yips and the rustling of new life in the trees, he realized something. The cabin was no longer just a place to exist. It was a home. For the first time in years, he was no longer alone, and neither was Maggie. The Vanishing Guardian. It was on one of those warmer afternoons, as the last patches of ice melted into the soil, that Maggie stepped onto the porch and noticed something. A single set of paw prints in the damp earth, leading toward the forest. David followed her gaze, his heart tightening. The wolf. It had come back, but only to say goodbye. Maggie stepped forward, sniffing at the tracks, her ears twitching. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess he figured his job was done," he murmured. Maggie stood there for a long time, staring toward the trees. Then, as if accepting the truth, she turned back to David, and for the first time she wagged her tail. The final choice. That night, as David sat by the fire watching the puppies curl up beside their mother, a thought settled into his mind. They had come so far, survived so much, and now they had a future he would not take away from them. So, the next morning, he drove into town, visited the local veterinarian, and signed the papers. Officially, they were his, Maggie. Every single one of her pups. They had a home, forever. And as he stepped back into the cabin that evening, the sun dipping low behind the mountains, he knew. This time, no one was being left behind. To be continued in another life,